She sat alone at the wedding feast until a giant Viking said, "Act like you're with me." The hall stretched wide under high, arched ceilings, lit by hundreds of flickering candles. The shadows danced across tapestries that told stories of kings and warriors long gone. A cold wind whispered through the open windows, carrying the scent of snow and pine from the fjord outside. Tonight, the hall should have been full of laughter, music, and celebration, but Alara felt only the weight of eyes that were not looking at her. She sat at the end of a long, polished wooden table, her fingers lightly tracing the carved patterns in the surface. Her dress was modest, dark green with silver embroidery, but it seemed to disappear in the candlelight. Around her, noble guests whispered, their voices soft but sharp, cutting like the edges of their finely crafted daggers. Alara had been born into a family that once held prestige, but that was a memory now. Tonight, at the wedding feast of another noble house, she was a shadow. A presence that everyone saw but no one noticed. The laughter of other guests echoed across the hall. Men and women clinked goblets, telling stories that she could barely hear over the pounding of her heart. She dared not look at the bride or groom for fear of drawing attention, yet her eyes kept wandering to the center of the hall where the bride gleamed in gold and white, smiling so perfectly that it seemed almost cruel to watch. Her own reflection in the polished silver beside her plate made her flinch. The girl staring back seemed smaller than she remembered, vulnerable, forgotten. A sudden murmur drew her attention. Guests were talking quietly, exchanging glances and smirks. Alara caught snippets of words, sharp and judgmental. "She dares sit alone," one voice said. "Did no one teach her manners?" Another laughed softly, a sound that grated on her nerves. She pressed her lips together, willing herself to shrink further into her chair. She had learned long ago that appearing invisible was safer than drawing attention, but a part of her, stubborn and quietly defiant, longed for someone to see her as more than a shadow. And then she saw him. He stepped through the tall double doors like a force of nature. The hall seemed to shiver as his boots struck the stone floor. Hakon, the giant chieftain of the northern fjords, loomed above everyone, his presence impossible to ignore. His broad shoulders, strong jaw, and sharp eyes marked him as a man who had commanded respect and fear for decades. But it was the strange mixture of command and mystery in his gaze that made Alara's heart skip. He scanned the hall slowly, deliberately, until his eyes settled on her. Alara felt a jolt of panic. She had heard of Hakon's reputation, stories whispered in shadowed corners of the kingdom. Some spoke of his victories in battle, others of his family's strange legacy, bound to the ancient spirits of their ancestors. No one dared cross him lightly, and yet now he was walking straight toward her. "You," he said, his voice low but carrying across the table. "Stand." Alara's pulse raced. She hesitated, unsure whether he meant her to leave her seat or merely acknowledge him. The hall fell silent, eyes turned, curious and wary. With a deep breath she rose, her hands gripping the edges of her chair. She tried to straighten, tried to appear unafraid, though her stomach churned. "Sit with me," Hakon commanded, nodding toward the empty space beside him. "Act like you belong." The words were strange, almost gentle, but carried the weight of authority. Alara's throat tightened. To sit beside him was dangerous in ways she did not yet understand. Yet there was no choice. Slowly, she moved toward him, her steps measured, each one echoing in the tense quiet of the hall. As she reached his side, she felt the heat of his presence, a mix of power and quiet restraint. He did not speak again, simply nodded, as if giving her permission to exist beside him. And in that moment, surrounded by whispers and sideways glances, Alara felt something strange: protection. Something she had not felt in years. The music resumed, a haunting melody played on lutes and flutes. Hakon's eyes followed the movement of the dancers, yet they often flicked back to her, unspoken questions hiding in their depths. She could feel it, the pull between fear and fascination, between caution and curiosity. She did not trust him, not fully. Yet for reasons she could not name, she did not want to step away. Throughout the feast, nobles continued to whisper. Some eyes carried judgment, others curiosity, and a few bore resentment. Alara tried to keep her attention on the food, on the soft clinking of silverware, but it was impossible. The entire room seemed to pulse with the tension between them. Hakon's presence drew attention like a magnet, and by extension, so did she. At one point, a man with slick-back hair and a sharp smile leaned close to another guest. "She sits with Hakon," he whispered. "Why would he bother? She is nothing but a shadow." Alara's fingers clenched around her goblet, but Hakon's hand appeared on the table near hers, a quiet anchor. His fingers did not touch hers, yet the gesture carried a silent message. She was not alone. The audacity of the act, the courage to make a statement in a hall filled with critics, struck her as both terrifying and exhilarating. The feast continued. Platters of roasted meat and fresh bread were passed, cups of spiced wine circulated, and laughter rose and fell like waves. And yet, despite the normalcy, Alara could not shake the feeling that something else lingered in the hall. Eyes that were not human, shadows that moved too quickly, whispers that seemed to echo in corners where no one stood. She shook her head, blaming nerves and imagination. Perhaps, but then she noticed it, a movement high above near the rafters, a figure dark and cloaked, watching. Their gaze was fixed upon her, but it was not curiosity alone. There was malice there, cold and deliberate, and a strange thrill of danger that sent a shiver down her spine. She tried to focus on the feast, on Hakon, but her eyes kept drifting to that shadow. Hakon noticed too. His jaw tightened, and his hand tightened into a fist, though he remained calm, commanding in every sense. A subtle warning passed through the air. The shadow would not approach while he was near, but the threat was real. Alara's breath hitched. She realized that stepping beside Hakon had placed her directly in the path of forces she could not yet name or understand. "Do you see him?" she whispered, barely moving her lips. Hakon's eyes flicked to the rafters, then back to her. "Yes," he said softly, "but do not fear. Not while I am here." The words were simple, yet they carried a gravity that settled over her like a cloak. Alara had spent her life learning to survive alone, hiding, shrinking. But for the first time in many years, she felt the strange, unfamiliar warmth of trust, an unspoken promise that someone might truly see her and stand by her side. Still, the shadow lingered, its presence a reminder that this night was only the beginning. The wedding feast, with all its music and laughter, was not as safe as it seemed. And as Hakon's eyes returned to hers, Alara understood something crucial. She had entered a world where power and danger were intertwined, where every smile might hide a threat, and every glance could hold secrets. The candles flickered, casting long, quivering shadows across the hall. The laughter of the guests rose and fell, a fragile melody beneath the tension that hummed between them. And in the silence that followed, Alara felt it, a pulse of something ancient, a rhythm tied to Hakon, tied to the shadows that lurked unseen, waiting. Her hand trembled slightly as she touched the edge of the table, but Hakon's steady gaze met hers again. No words passed, but the message was clear. Survive this night. Stand with me. And perhaps, in time, understand the truth hidden beneath the veneer of laughter and gold. The final notes of the lute faded into silence for a moment, and in that pause the shadow in the rafters moved, just a step, a whisper of a threat, and then it vanished. Alara swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her ears. She knew, deep in her heart, that nothing in this hall would ever be the same again. Tonight was not merely a wedding feast. Tonight marked the beginning of a journey, one where trust and danger, desire and fear, would intertwine in ways she could not yet imagine. And as the hall continued to hum with life and laughter, she realized she was no longer alone, and that both salvation and peril might come from the giant beside her, the one who had told her simply, "Act like you belong." The night air outside the hall was sharp and cold, but inside, the warmth of torches and laughter could not mask the tension that clung to Alara. She could still feel the weight of the shadow in the rafters, a silent promise of danger. Every smile and gesture of the guests now seemed layered with hidden meaning, as if the walls themselves whispered secrets she could not fully hear. She sat beside Hakon, the giant Viking chieftain, whose presence seemed to steady the chaos around her. Yet even with him near, a shiver of uncertainty ran down her spine. Hakon did not speak for several moments, letting the music and the chatter of the feast fill the silence. His gaze, steady and piercing, never left her, and Alara felt both exposed and protected under it. She wanted to ask him questions, to understand why he had chosen her among all the guests, but something in his posture told her it was wiser to remain silent, for now. There was power in patience, he seemed to say without words. As the night deepened, a horn sounded, signaling the beginning of the ceremonial dances. Couples rose, moving gracefully across the polished floor, their feet echoing lightly against the stones. Hakon rose as well, though his size made him seem almost too large for the delicate movements of the dance. Yet when he extended his hand to Alara, it was a command she could not refuse. Hesitantly she placed her hand in his, feeling the strength of his grip, the reassurance that he would not let her stumble. "Follow my lead," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper but firm enough to guide her. "Do not fear." Alara felt a strange thrill course through her. This was a man of strength, yet he trusted her to move with him to match his rhythm, even in a world she barely understood. As they danced, she became aware of the attention they drew. Whispers rose, soft but sharp, slicing through the music. Some eyes glimmered with curiosity, others with jealousy. Yet no one dared interrupt them while Hakon's gaze remained fixed on her. For the first time, Alara realized that power could be both frightening and protective. Hakon's presence alone commanded respect, but it was his willingness to include her, to make her visible beside him, that made her heart race. She began to understand that this night was not just about appearances. It was about influence, about the subtle assertion of authority, and the courage to claim one's place in a world that often sought to erase the weak. As the dance continued, Hakon leaned closer, his voice brushing against her ear. "The night is not as it seems," he murmured. "There are eyes that watch, forces that linger. You must be careful." Alara felt a chill run through her despite the warmth of the hall. "I felt it," she whispered. "Earlier in the rafters, someone or something was watching." Hakon's eyes darkened. "Not someone, something. This hall has walls older than any of us. It remembers, it guards, and it judges. You have drawn attention, Alara, far more than you realize." She swallowed hard, suddenly aware that her every movement, every choice, had consequences that reached beyond mere social expectations. The dance ended, and the music softened into a slow, haunting melody. Hakon guided her back to their seats, his hand never leaving hers until she sat. The subtle intimacy of the gesture, the gentle command of his presence, left her heart pounding in ways she could not name. Across the hall, a group of nobles murmured amongst themselves. One of them, a young woman with sharp eyes, leaned toward her companion. "She moves like she belongs," she said, voice low, carrying just enough for Alara to hear. "I don't know how, but she is with him." Alara's cheeks burned. Part of her wanted to shrink away, to disappear into the shadows once more. But a stronger, more defiant part refused. She would not let judgment define her, not when Hakon had shown her a glimpse of something she had never known, acceptance, or perhaps even respect. As the feast progressed, the conversation around them shifted. Hakon spoke to the nobles with authority, carefully choosing his words, guiding the flow of discourse, while Alara listened, learning the intricate dance of power that governed this hall. She realized that he was not only a warrior but a master of influence, capable of commanding loyalty with a glance, and respect with mere presence. And somehow, in the midst of this subtle but potent power, she felt a connection forming between them, one that went beyond words or appearances. Suddenly, a commotion arose at the far end of the hall. A rival noble dressed in fine silk stepped forward, his expression sharp with disdain. "Hakon," he said loudly, drawing the attention of all, "I hope your presence here does not insult our gathering. Your family's deeds in the north are well known." He paused, smirking. "And your judgment of alliances questionable at best." A hush fell over the hall. Hakon's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening, but he did not rise. His hand remained near Alara, a subtle but clear reminder that she was not to be harmed. Then, with a sudden, almost imperceptible gesture, a ripple seemed to pass through the hall. The accuser froze mid-step, his words hanging in the air as if suspended by an invisible force. Whispers erupted, some with fear, others with awe. Ilara's breath caught. She had seen hints of his strength before, but this was something else entirely. Hakon's gaze returned to the man, steady and unyielding. "Consider your words more carefully," he said quietly, but the authority in his voice left no room for misinterpretation. The man bowed stiffly, a mixture of fear and grudging respect in his eyes. The hall relaxed, but the tension did not dissipate. Everyone had felt the power, the warning that Hakon wielded effortlessly. And Alara understood, perhaps for the first time, the depth of the world she had stepped into, a world where danger and protection walked hand in hand. The shadow in the rafters had not moved, but its presence was undeniable. Alara felt its gaze like a cold wind, reminding her that the night was far from over. She shifted slightly, aware that while she was safe beside Hakon, the world beyond the warmth of his influence was filled with uncertainty and threat. "Why me?" she asked softly after a long pause, her voice barely audible over the lingering notes of the lute. Hakon's eyes met hers, serious and unreadable. "Because you will not cower," he said. "Because you have something that even I cannot command, courage. And because this night, this place, demands someone who will stand, even when shadows watch." Alara did not know how to respond. The words stirred something deep within her, a mixture of pride and fear. Courage had always been an idea she aspired to, but never a reality. Yet here she was, standing, moving, even dancing beside a man whose very presence could bend the room to his will. As the feast wore on, Hakon leaned back in his seat, watching the celebrations with a calm intensity. Alara, beside him, felt the strange mixture of exhilaration and anxiety. She had been thrust into a world where appearances mattered, where every movement was scrutinized, and where ancient forces lingered just beyond the sight of ordinary eyes. Yet she also felt the pull of something deeper, a connection, fragile but undeniable, that tied her to this giant Viking and to the mysteries he carried. When the final toast of the evening was called, Hakon raised his cup. The hall echoed with the clinking of goblets and murmurs of approval, but as Alara lifted hers, she noticed movement in the corners of her vision. The shadow, always watching, slipped silently along the rafters, a whisper of menace that refused to be ignored. Her hand trembled slightly, though she kept her expression steady. Hakon's eyes flicked to the rafters, then back to her. His presence was a shield, but the unspoken truth was clear. The danger had not passed. Whoever or whatever had watched her earlier was patient, and it was not done yet. As the guests began to leave, the hall emptying gradually, Hakon guided her toward the exit, his hand brushing hers in a gesture that was protective, commanding, and intimate all at once. Outside, the wind from the fjord bit at her cheeks, a reminder of the cold, harsh world beyond the warmth of the hall. Hakon's cloak, heavy and dark, fell around them both as he led her to a secluded terrace, far from the lingering eyes of nobles and whispers. "Tell me what you feel," he said quietly, his voice carrying over the sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs below. "Do you trust me?" Alara hesitated, searching his face. There was honesty there, tempered by the weight of secrets she could only sense but not name. Slowly she nodded. I want to. I feel safe with you, but I do not understand why. Hakon's gaze softened just slightly, revealing the man behind the giant. Understanding comes later. For now, trust must be enough. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind tugging at their cloaks, the moonlight casting silver patterns across the stone floor. And then, a sudden movement in the shadows, a flash, a whisper, a presence that was neither fully seen nor fully imagined, made Alara's heart leap. The shadow from the rafters had returned, closer now, testing boundaries. Hakon tensed beside her, a silent warning. "It is coming," he said. "We must be ready." Alara swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the terrace. The night, which had begun with music and laughter, now held something far darker. Yet in the midst of fear, she felt the strange thrill of being alive, of being seen, of standing beside someone who could protect her, and yet demand everything of her courage in return. The first stars of night glimmered above, silent witnesses to the unfolding story. And Alara knew, with a certainty that both terrified and exhilarated her, that the events of this evening were only the beginning. The shadow would not rest, and neither could she. But neither would Hakon. And together, whether she understood it or not, they would face whatever came next. The storm outside had grown stronger by the time Alara and Hakon reached the cliffside tower. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the jagged rocks and the dark waves crashing against them below. The wind tugged at their cloaks and hair, carrying a chill that bit through even the thickest fabric. Yet neither moved away from the other. Hakon's presence was steady, an unyielding anchor against the wild night. And for Alara, every step toward the tower felt like stepping into another world, one of power, danger, and secrets that had waited centuries to be revealed. The tower itself was ancient, built of dark stone worn smooth by time and storms. Its windows were tall and narrow, as if designed to keep something out, or in. Hakon pushed open the heavy door, and the echo of the hinges sounded like a warning. The interior was dimly lit by torches set in sconces along the walls. Shadows danced across the spiral staircase and stone floor, moving like living things. Alara felt her heart pound in her chest, a mix of fear and excitement. "This is," she began, but Hakon stopped her with a raised hand. "Do not speak yet," he said softly, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made her tremble. "There are things here you must see, and things you must feel before you try to understand them." He led her up the narrow stairs, the wind howling outside as if it wanted to follow them. Alara kept her gaze on the steps, but she could not resist stealing glances at Hakon. He moved with the ease of a man who had walked these halls countless times, yet his eyes betrayed a caution, a constant awareness of something unseen. She realized that this was not just a tower. It was a place of power, of history, of curses that reached beyond human memory. At the top, Hakon paused. The room was circular, with walls covered in old tapestries that depicted battles, storms, and rituals. In the center, a single stone pedestal held a carved chest, worn with age. The air was thick, almost alive, and Alara felt it pressing against her skin. She could hear her own heartbeat, rapid and loud in the silence. "This is where it began," Hakon said, his hand brushing over the chest, "and where it continues. The curse, the legacy of my family, it is tied to this place, to the blood that runs through me." Alara's breath caught. She had sensed something unusual about Hakon from the first moment she met him, but hearing the words aloud made it real. "A curse," she whispered. "What do you mean?" Hakon's eyes darkened. "Generations ago, my ancestors angered forces older than kingdoms. Spirits bound to this land, guardians of power and law, decided that those who took without honor must pay. My family was marked. Every chieftain, every heir bears the weight of their deeds. I am no exception." Alara shivered, not just from the cold. "And me? Why am I here?" He looked at her, and for the first time vulnerability touched his massive features. because you are not afraid to stand. And because the curse responds to courage, to presence. You drew attention tonight not by accident. You are tied to the fate of this family now, whether you understand it or not. The weight of his words pressed on her chest. She had entered this world as a stranger, but now she realized she was no longer just a guest in Hakon's life. She was entwined with it, with the forces that had haunted his ancestors for centuries. And with that knowledge came fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing herself, and fear of the power that Hakon wielded so effortlessly. Hakon stepped closer, the warmth of his body a stark contrast to the chill in the room. I should have warned you, but some truths cannot be hidden. Some fates must be faced directly. Alara swallowed hard. I don't know if I can face it. You can, he said firmly, because you are stronger than you think, but it will demand everything of us, courage, trust, and sacrifice. They stood in silence for a long moment, the wind outside rattling the stone walls, the storm's rhythm echoing the tension between them. And then the air shifted. A shadow moved along the walls, a presence that was not entirely human. Ilara's pulse leapt. She had sensed it in the hall earlier, now it was here, close, pressing against them, testing their resolve. Hakon's hand found hers, and this time he held it firmly. Do not let fear rule you, he whispered. Stand with me, face it. The shadow grew darker, stretching like smoke, forming shapes that hinted at eyes, wings, claws. It was the curse itself, or a fragment of it, a sentinel sent to warn, to challenge, to punish. Ilara felt a wave of panic, but Hakon's steady presence anchored her. She focused on him, on the strength in his gaze, on the quiet promise that he would not let her fall. Together, they moved toward the center of the room. The shadow recoiled slightly as Hakon stepped forward, his voice rising in a chant that echoed off the walls. Ancient words, old as the stones themselves, vibrated through the air, carrying a force that made Ilara's hair stand on end. She had no idea what he said, but she felt the meaning: command, control, protection. The shadow lunged, and for the first time Ilara felt the danger of the curse physically. It was a force of will, a pressure that threatened to push them apart, to consume the room. Yet she did not let go of Hakon's hand. She focused, as he had instructed, on courage, on trust, on standing together. The shadow hissed, twisted, and then slowly began to retreat, dissipating into the corners of the room like smoke in sunlight. Ilara's legs trembled, but she did not fall. Hakon's hand squeezed hers, and he gave a small, approving nod. You see, he said quietly, the curse tests us, always, but it can be held at bay if we act as one, if we trust. Ilara took a shaky breath, the adrenaline slowly ebbing from her veins. She realized in that moment how much she had underestimated herself, and how much she had begun to rely on Hakon. Not merely for protection, but for guidance, for understanding, for the courage to face what she could not face alone. Hakon studied her, his eyes softer now, almost reflective. You are stronger than many who have faced this place, he said. And yet, there is more you must understand, more you must learn if we are to survive what is coming. She looked at him, her fear mingled with curiosity, with awe. Teach me, she whispered. I want to understand, I want to stand with you. Hakon's lips curved in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Then you will, but know this: trust is only the beginning. The curse is patient. It waits, and it will challenge everything you believe about yourself and about me. Ilara nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and excitement. The storm outside mirrored the storm within her, a turmoil of emotion, courage, and the strange pull of connection she felt with Hakon. She realized that in this moment nothing else mattered, neither the hall, nor the whispers of nobles, nor the world beyond the tower. All that mattered was survival, trust, and the bond forming between them. Suddenly, a distant sound echoed through the tower, faint but distinct, a whispering voice carried on the wind. Ilara froze. Hakon's gaze sharpened, his hand tightening over hers. The curse communicates, he said quietly. Not in words we understand, but in signs, in presence. It tests us, watches us, learns us. Alara felt a shiver run down her spine. The whispering grew louder, swirling around them, yet she could not see its source. It was as if the tower itself was alive, observing, waiting for a mistake. And yet, in that oppressive presence, she found a strange clarity. She knew that running was not an option. Survival meant facing the unknown, standing with Haken, and accepting that danger was part of the path they had chosen together. Haken led her to a small alcove in the tower, where a worn rug and a low bench offered a place to rest. The storm outside raged, but inside they found a fragile stillness. He guided her to sit, his eyes never leaving hers. "Rest," he said softly. "We will need strength for what is coming." Alara sank onto the bench, exhaustion and adrenaline mingling in her veins. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly look at Haken, not the chieftain, not the legend, not the force of power, but the man beneath it all. His eyes, dark and intense, softened with a depth she had never expected. In them, she saw burden, loneliness, and a quiet longing for something he had long believed unattainable. And she realized with a sudden, startling clarity that she longed to be the one to reach him. To stand with him not just as a guest or an observer, but as someone who mattered. The storm howled outside, the lightning casting sharp shadows across the walls. The shadow from the hall had not returned, but its presence lingered in their minds. Alara knew that the challenges ahead were only beginning. The curse would not rest, nor would the forces it controlled. But she also knew that standing beside Haken, feeling the strength in his hand, the warmth in his presence, she had a chance, perhaps for the first time in her life, to face the darkness and survive. As dawn threatened the horizon, a faint glow touching the jagged cliffs below, Alara understood something vital. The night of the feast had changed everything. She was no longer just a spectator in the lives of the powerful. She was part of their story, part of the legacy of the tower, and part of a bond that might survive the shadows or be consumed by them. And Haken, towering, steadfast, and enigmatic, would not let her face it alone. The wind whispered through the cracks of the tower, carrying a promise. The curse would return, stronger, smarter, more relentless. But so would they together. The first light of dawn barely touched the jagged cliffs below, and the storm that had raged through the night began to soften, leaving only the sharp scent of rain and salt in the air. Yet inside the tower, the tension was far from over. Shadows lingered in corners, curling along the stone walls as though they were alive. Alara stood beside Haken at the edge of the terrace, her hands gripping the cold stone. Her heart pounded not just from fear but from anticipation, from the realization that the final test had come. Haken's eyes scanned the horizon, sharp and alert. "The curse knows we are here," he said quietly, his voice carrying over the roar of the fading wind. "It will challenge us directly. We cannot hesitate." Alara swallowed, the chill from the storm mixing with the adrenaline thrumming in her veins. She felt the pull of fear, but also a growing strength within her, a courage that had been nurtured through nights of whispered warnings, dances in grand halls, and shadows that tested her resolve. Now, at the edge of everything, she realized that she would not run. Not from the curse, and not from the man who had become the anchor of her courage. The shadow from the hall returned, larger this time, darker and more solid. It moved like smoke, and smoke never should, twisting and stretching, forming the vague shape of wings, sharp claws, and hollow eyes. Alara's stomach clenched at the sight, but Haken did not flinch. He stepped forward, his hands glowing faintly with a light that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the tower itself. "Stand behind me," he commanded. "Trust me." Alara obeyed, moving close to him. She could feel the warmth radiating from his presence, the immense power he had controlled all his life. For a moment, she feared the shadow would engulf them, that the curse would be too strong, that the night would end with a scream instead of sunrise. But she did not look away. She held his hand, letting the steady pulse of his strength guide her. The shadow lunged. The air shivered as it passed, a cold so intense it made her teeth chatter. Hakon raised his other hand, chanting words older than any kingdom, words that vibrated through the stones of the tower and into her bones. The shadow hissed, recoiling from the sound, but it was not yet defeated. "You must face it," Hakon said. "Do not shrink. Do not fear. It feeds on hesitation." Alara nodded, drawing a deep breath. She squared her shoulders and stepped forward, letting the light of Hakon's power wash over her. "I will not fear," she whispered. "Not now, not ever." The shadow twisted and wailed, a sound that seemed both angry and sorrowful. For the first time, she realized it was not merely a threat. It was a reflection of Hakon's family, a collection of pain and anger passed down through generations. The curse was alive because it had never been understood, never been faced with courage or compassion. Hakon glanced at her, eyes wide with respect. "You understand," he said softly. "You feel it. That is why we can end this." Together they stepped forward. Hakon's hands glowed brighter and the shadow shrieked, retreating to the edges of the tower. Alara added her voice, her courage, her presence. She spoke not words of magic but of defiance and hope. "You will not control us," she said. "You will not harm the innocent. You will end," the shadow faltered. It twisted, hesitated, and then, with a final cry that echoed through the tower and into the cliffs below, it dissolved into a cloud of mist that vanished into the wind. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant crash of waves against stone. Alara's knees trembled, but she remained standing. Hakon's hand squeezed hers, a silent acknowledgement that together they had survived. For a moment they simply breathed, listening to the quiet. The curse, though diminished, had not entirely disappeared, but it had been tested and confronted, and for the first time in generations it had met courage and will that it could not consume. Hakon lowered his hands, the faint glow fading. He turned to her, his eyes searching, his expression softening. "You were incredible," he said. "I have never faced the curse with anyone beside me who could hold their own. You changed everything." Alara felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She had faced fear before, yes, but never like this. Never with such stakes. She realized how much she had grown, how much courage she had found in the presence of a man she could trust, a man who had trusted her in return. I couldn't have done it without you," she said softly. Hakon smiled faintly, a rare warmth breaking through the weight of his usual command. "No," he admitted. "You faced it. You were not afraid. That is why we survived." The wind softened further, carrying the first light of sunrise across the fjord below. The towers of the hall and the cliffs gleamed in gold and silver, and the distant mountains shimmered through the mist. For the first time in what felt like forever, Alara felt a sense of calm, a fragile peace that hinted at possibility and hope. Hakon stepped closer, and she could see the depth of his humanity for the first time. The burden he carried, the loneliness, the responsibility, it was all there, but it was tempered by something else now: connection, trust, and a bond forged in shadows and storms. "Alara," he said, voice low, almost hesitant. "This night I was certain you would run, certain you would fear too much, but you stayed. You chose to face the unknown. You chose to stand with me." Her chest tightened and she realized she could not speak at first. Instead, she simply nodded, letting her gaze meet his. In that moment, words were unnecessary. The storm, the shadow, the curse, all of it had brought them here to this fragile clarity. "I want to be with you," she said finally, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "Not because I have to, but because I choose to." Hakon's eyes softened completely, the first true smile forming across his face. "Then we will face the world together," he said. "No curse, no shadow, no power can separate us, if we remain united." They stood for a long moment, the wind whispering around them, the clouds breaking to reveal the first rays of morning. Alara felt a mixture of relief, awe, and a deep, unspoken longing. She knew the path ahead would still hold danger, that the curse was not entirely gone, that the world would not pause for them. But she also knew that she had found someone who would stand by her, who would trust her, and who had allowed her to discover the courage within herself. "Look," Hacken said softly, pointing toward the horizon. The sun rose fully now, casting a golden path across the fjord. The storm cloud still lingered, but the light was stronger, promising a new beginning. Even darkness must yield to light eventually. Even curses must face those who are brave enough to stand. Alara let her eyes follow the sun's path, and a sense of hope blossomed inside her. She realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. And in that moment, with Hacken beside her, she understood that they could face anything together. The shadow had retreated, but she knew it would return one day in some form or another. Yet now she felt ready. With Hacken's guidance, his strength, and her own newfound resolve, she would not be afraid. Together they would confront the curse, the darkness, and whatever else the world might send their way. Hacken stepped closer, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Are you ready?" he asked. Alara looked up at him, her eyes clear and determined. "Yes," she said, "I am ready." With you, a breeze swept across the terrace, carrying the scent of rain and pine, the promise of new beginnings. And though the journey was far from over, a fragile peace settled between them, forged in courage, trust, and the shared experience of facing shadows that had haunted generations. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered, a reminder of the power of courage, the strength of connection, and the bond formed between two hearts standing side by side against the darkness. Alara and Hacken looked out over the fjord, the cliffs bathed in morning light. Their hands found each other again, clasped tightly, a symbol of unity, defiance, and trust. The curse might return, the shadows might follow, but they had faced it together, and that bond, forged in fear and hope, would endure. And as the sun rose fully over the horizon, painting the world in gold and silver, Alara realized something she had never truly understood before. The heart's courage, when combined with trust and love, could shine brighter than any storm, stronger than any curse, and endure beyond the shadows that threatened to consume it.